But even the incitement to violence laws are very carefully written in most countries, precisely because it is so easy for somebody to take advantage of it and pretend that actually whenever somebody says something mean about them, it's incitement to violence. No, incitement laws are very, very carefully worded, and my view is it has to literally be, a mob outside somebody's house and somebody is standing there saying, get this person. Everything south of that is what we used to call life and just putting up with things. And my friend Fleming Rose, who made some international headlines some years ago when he commissioned a set of cartoons in Denmark, which didn't go unnoticed in parts of the world, wrote a very good book called The Tyranny of Silence, because he didn't realize what he was wading into when he did that. He was a former Soviet correspondent for the Danish newspapers and an expert in totalitarianism. But he really didn't realize quite how seriously his life was going to be affected by that. But he wrote a very good book called The Tyranny of Silence, which is a reflection of somebody who has spent many years thinking about speech and hate speech and so on. And he said something I wish was better known. He said, when you have a very, very diverse society, as ours have all become, you basically have two directions you can go with speech. You either decide that the authorities have the duty to police speech utterly, or people in the society have to become aware that they have to get used to hearing a lot of opinions. And as he says, the second is far preferable to the first.
Douglas Murray's about to expose how the Great White North turned into the Ministry of Hurt Feelings. Want to see what happens when a country replaces common sense with comfort pandas? Trudeau's thought police are working overtime, and Murray's got the receipts. From standing ovations for actual Nazis, oops, to life sentences for mean tweets, this takedown is hotter than Tim Horton's coffee. And then watch as Murray digs deep into modern-day anti-Semitism.
And if you realize that, for instance, there are more slaves in the world today than there were at the height of the transatlantic slave trade, you realize the scale of the problem. And yet, where do you hear that? I'd love all those people who are so activist and so desperate to find meaning in their otherwise meaningless lives. I wish they'd divert their attentions to something where they could do something and could find meaning and could actually do good. There's no good you can do by digging up a 300-year-old dispute. There's a lot of good you can do by helping your neighbor.
So should people alive today be held responsible for wrongs done centuries ago to people who are now dead?
Well, I say that only if it's universal. Only if it's universal. If anyone is born into guilt, then it's got to go every way. And you try that. You try that. I mean, the future would be a scrum. No peoples in history have been perfect, just as no person is perfect. If you want to have the idea that some people are born into guilt, and that is something that is now being taught, particularly in America, and I think it's a moral obscenity. I think it would be obscene to go to, say, black people in America and say, you have inherited guilt because of something your forebears did. I think it would be obscene. And I think it's obscene to do that to white people. You can't do this to a child. And if you're going to do it, then, as I say, be my guest, try it out. See how Turkey comes out of that. See whether or not you're actually, instead of solving old wounds, are not just going to rip a whole load of new ones open.
Want real activism? There are actual slaves making your chocolate bars right now. But no, let's ignore those chains because, plot twist, they're not being held by dead white guys. Heaven forbid we address current human trafficking when we could be teaching 5-year-olds they're inherently evil based on melanin levels. Peak 2024, ignoring real slavery while getting paid to manufacture guilt about historical slavery. Slow clap for progress.
But I think the whole idea of hereditary guilt, I mean, it must be in some way a sort of form of spilt Christianity, which a lot of our era consists of. Spilt Christianity, I mean, it's a phrase of T.E. Hilmes, but it's where the residue of a religion ends up forming new particles and starting new movements. And I think that if society sort of gives up on the Judeo-Christian idea, nevertheless, aspects of it remain. And where we had original sin, we now have a sort of selective original sin, or original sin by racial base, and I think that is hell.
So to listen to some people in authority, particularly those associated with the left, hate is everywhere. Hate is rampant.
Yes.
And opposing hate justifies some of the most extreme measures. For example, many people in this room will know that the government of Canada has just tabled a bill in Parliament that would make online hate speech punishable by up to life in prison.
Life?
Life.
You don't get life for murder, do
Well,
you?
exactly. And judges would be empowered to put people under house arrest on the grounds that those people might commit acts of hate. Not that they had, but that just on the grounds that they might. Now, you, on the other hand, repeatedly lament in your books the absence of other emotions in the way we talk to each other.
Yes.
Things like hope, reconciliation, and love. Is hate so prevalent, and can we make a central place for these other positive emotions?
Well, I mean, the very idea is utterly juvenile, which is why, if I may say something that's slightly abusive towards the country I'm sitting in, which is why it's pushed by your current government. Nobody who has thought for a moment about humankind could think you could eradicate hate.
Canada's giving life sentences for mean tweets, while murderers get Netflix and chill. Trudeau's thought police, or TM, can put you under house arrest for potentially hurting feelings. Welcome to Maple Syrup. 1984. These secular priests replaced original sin with being born white, but their confessional booths are now TikTok struggle sessions. When did Canada transform from hockey warriors into professional feelings protectors? Sorry about your freedom, eh?
Nobody who has thought for a moment about humankind could think you could eradicate hate. It's preposterous. I mean, I like to say, you know, after Justin Trudeau has managed to stop hate, what will he do next? Would he like to do gluttony? Sloth is on the table. Avarice, lust. I mean, these are parts of the human condition. You have to be a moral imbecile not to know this. And hate is an unpleasant thing, but it's ineradicable. It's able to be tempered, and sometimes, by the way, it's useful to use. The idea you can eradicate such a thing, I mean, everybody, all of us in our hearts have hate and the potential for hate. Part of the thing of mastering your life is to try to diminish it, to keep it down. But the idea that it can be eradicated, let alone eradicated by some petty bureaucrat, is it shows people who have not thought about anything at all. And the idea, of course, that you can sort of go around and identify hate. Again, you know, my late friend Christopher Hitchens gave a great speech here in Canada probably about 15 years ago. I can't remember which university it was, somebody might know, where he addressed this when the Canadian Human Rights Tribunals were doing their thing. He said there, it's all about who decides what the hate is. Mm-hmm. I mean, I might decide tomorrow, if I was a lunatic, that everything that was ever said against me that was critical is hate. I could say it's anti-Douglas hate, and I'm not putting up with it anymore. And I'm going to go to the police station every day and bother them until everyone's nice to me.
Breaking news, Trudeau declares war on human nature. After solving hate, he'll tackle lust, bye-bye Tinder, Gluttony, rye-pea poutine, and Netflix-induced sloth. Canada's bureaucrats think they can legislate away basic human emotions. Next up, outlawing sadness and mandating joy. Life sentences for mean tweets while actual criminals get spa treatments. What's next? Thought crime divisions staffed by empathy unicorns? Sorry. Your feelings hurt my feelings.
Where do you even start? I mean, life is hateful. We all get old. We all die. Everyone we love will die. Is there anything the Canadian government can do about that?
Don't give them any ideas.
Absolutely. Well, of course, now you can be euthanized, so that takes that problem out. These are preposterous ideas. And again, like, who is the person who decides what is hateful in this situation? My view is that the laws of the land on these things in most countries were pretty solid up until recently. And the only thing I regard in speech or anything else as warranting some kind of government intervention is incitement to violence.
Yeah.
But even the incitement to violence laws are very carefully written in most countries, precisely because it is so easy for somebody to take advantage of it and pretend that actually whenever somebody says something mean about them, it's incitement to violence. No, incitement laws are very, very carefully worded. And my view is it has to literally be, a mob outside somebody's house and somebody is standing there saying, "Get this person." Everything south of that is what we used to call life and just putting up with things. And my friend Fleming Rose, who made some international headlines some years ago when he commissioned a set of cartoons in Denmark, which didn't go unnoticed in parts of the world, wrote a very good book called The Tyranny of Silence, because he didn't realize what he was wading into when he did that. He was a former Soviet correspondent for the Danish newspapers and an expert in totalitarianism. But he really didn't realize quite how seriously his life was going to be affected by that. But
Canada to the rescue. Life sucks, people die, no problem. Trudeau's ready to outlaw mortality or euthanize you first. Hate speech, better define it quickly, because saying I hate pineapple on pizza might land you in jail. Where does this end? Mob outside your house with torches? Illegal incitement? Aren't Karen saying, "You've put on weight"? Life in prison? Bureaucrats deciding what's hateful is how you get Denmark cartoon riots on repeat.
Wrote a very good book called The Tyranny of Silence, because he didn't realize what he was wading into when he did that. He was a former Soviet correspondent for the Danish newspapers and an expert in totalitarianism. But he really didn't realize quite how seriously his life was going to be affected by that. But he wrote a very good book called The Tyranny of Silence, which is a reflection of somebody who has spent many years thinking about speech and hate speech and so on. And he said something I wish was better known. He said, when you have a very, very diverse society, as ours have all become, you basically have two directions you can go with speech. You either decide that the authorities have the duty to police speech utterly, or people in the society have to become aware that they have to get used to hearing a lot of opinions. And as he says, the second is far preferable to the first.
I can't help myself, since you mentioned Canada and some of the things going on here. In October last year, you published an op-ed in the National Post, the headline of which was "Canada's Descent into Ignorance Shocks the World." And the subhead was, "An unbearable stupidity has trickled down from the Liberal government." And you don't express yourself clearly, Douglas, do you?
No, I know. I always leave room for...
Do you have no love for Canada?
I have a great deal of love for Canada. It's why I wrote that. I can't remember what the specifically idiotic thing was that they'd done that that prompted that. There's such a litany that I wonder what it was.
Oh, I think it was the Nazi event in Parliament.
Yes, of course. Yes. That was beautiful in a way, wasn't it? That people who see Nazis everywhere,
can't identify a real one.
And actually invite them. I mean, it was so fantastically demonstrative of. Again, it goes back to this. Who decides in the society once you get into this nannying place of hate and eradicating hate, and everything's got to be anti-hate and.
Canada, where a government obsessed with hate could invite a literal Nazi to Parliament and still lecture the world on morality. These are the experts deciding what you can and can't say. People so blind they can't even spot an actual Nazi in the room. Fleming Rose was right. Diverse societies either tolerate different opinions or they let petty bureaucrats play God. Trudeau picked God. Spoiler alert, the rest of us get hell.
Who decides? Who's competent? I mean, it turned out that the speaker here, far from competent, unfortunately. The whole of the House that stood, actually far from competent. If anyone knows their Ukrainian history, by the way, you could work it out for yourself. You really could. I dread to think what was going through Zelensky's head as he saw everyone stand up and felt he had to as well. But anyone who knows about Ukrainian history would have known if you were fighting the Russians in Ukraine, you were not part of the proto-democratic Ukrainian government. But this is the thing. Who has the right to decide or to say or to tell you or me what we can write or say? And the answer is people utterly unqualified to do so. And it's not just that they are unqualified, anyone is unqualified. Anyone. As Christopher said in that speech in Canada years ago, who is the person you would nominate to decide which books I can read? Who would you nominate? Who do you know who's good enough? Who do you know who's virtuous enough and wise enough and always will be? I'm waiting for a nomination. I've never heard one.
I think our Prime Minister would volunteer for that job.
Yes, I said on stage with Jordan Peterson a few months ago, I don't like to tread on people's private lives, but when your Prime Minister announced his separation from his wife, I said it's probably the first time a man has divorced his wife because he wants to spend more time with himself.
Get this, Canada's Parliament gave a standing ovation to an actual Nazi veteran, oops, while pushing laws that could jail you for life over mean Facebook posts. These same geniuses, who can't use Google to check basic history, want to control what everyone can say. And leading this circus, Trudeau, who dumped his wife because his bathroom mirror needed more attention. Talk about priorities.
Still on this theme of Western values, but I want to talk about something that I think is looming very large in your mind right now, and that's Israel in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. Does Israel's continued existence as a lonely outpost of the kind of Western values we've been talking about in the Middle East present a peculiar and particular moral challenge to the West?
Yes, I think it does. I think it's at the forefront of the challenge. I've always found it a subject of extraordinary interest and oddity that the one country in the Middle East that most of us would wish to live in or could live in is the country that is most defamed and attacked, vilified and lied about. I find it an extraordinarily rich subject, actually. There's a novel I'm very fond of that by Vasily Grossman, the great Russian 20th century writer. I don't know if any of you have read, but Life and Fate. It's probably the great Russian novel of the 20th century. Grossman was actually Jewish himself. He was a reporter. His journalism was stunning. He was at Stalingrad for most of it, if you can imagine that. And he was also the first journalist into Treblinka. And his account of that is something to behold. Anyhow, Life and Fate, his great 900-page novel, travels through the midnight of the 20th century, from the camps to the gulags. And there's something very, very interesting that Grossman did, which is at the very middle of the novel, about the midnight of the 20th century, he devotes 3 pages to the subject of anti-Semitism.
Isn't it fascinating? The only Middle Eastern country where women can drive, LGBTQ folks can exist openly, and journalists won't get chopped up for criticizing the government is somehow the most vilified. It's like Grossman saw it coming in Life and Fate. He witnessed both Nazi death camps and Soviet gulags, yet placed anti-Semitism at his 900-page epic's heart. Why? Because he knew hate finds its most convenient target in those who dare to be different.
I wish it was better known, because he says almost everything you need to know about anti-Semitism. He says he says you find it in the Academy of Sciences and in the games children play in the yard. But this is the crucial insight he makes. He says everywhere and always it is a mirror of the person making the accusation. He says, show me what you accuse the Jews of, I'll tell you what you're guilty of. This seems to me utterly, demonstrably, visibly true. And I'm, again, anti-Semitism, like hate, we had a Labour leader in Britain a few years ago who was an anti-Semite, Jeremy Corbyn. And I mean, he was so anti-Semitic that he would attend wreath layings for the terrorists who killed the Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics. That's an odd thing to do if you're not an anti-Semite. He used to say, when he was cornered, he would say, that's why we have, when he was cornered on his history of anti-Semitism, he would sometimes say things like, that's why we have to eradicate anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and all forms of racism. And I always used to say, you know, the very first part of that demonstrates you've never thought about it. Because anyone who's ever thought about anti-Semitism knows that it's almost certainly ineradicable. It is a perverse thing in the human condition, a desire to lock onto a group that you identify as being responsible for whatever you want to accuse them of. And as my late friend Rabbi Jonathan Sachs used to say, you know, when the Jews didn't have a state, they were attacked for being stateless.
Want to know the ultimate? Tell me you're guilty without telling me you're guilty. Check what people accuse Jews of. Grossman nailed it. Anti-Semitism is just a mirror showing the accuser's own sins. Take Jeremy Corbyn, attends memorials for Munich Olympics terrorists while preaching about eradicating hate. Classic projection. Jews get blamed for being stateless wanderers, then blamed for having a state. Poor, they're parasites. Rich, they're controlling everything. It's never about Jews. It's about the accusers telling on themselves.
But that's common throughout the history of anti-Semitism. I mean, the Jews were criticized for being religious and for being secular. They were criticized for being rich and being poor. They were criticized for being the Rothschilds and Russian peasants. They shtetl livers. They were, there's an extraordinary book that Thomas Stoppard introduced me to by someone called Gregor von Retzori, called, rather lurid title, called The Memoirs of an Anti-Semite. But it has an extraordinary passage in it in which this young man growing up in Habsburg, Austro-Hungary, takes a Jewish woman who he's in love with, who's been older than him, out for dinner. And during dinner, he meets some people he knows from his cavalry unit. And the woman he's with, he knows what they're thinking, and he knows what they're thinking of him. And the scene culminates in him slapping the woman because he is horrified by her desire to behave like everyone else. And this also points to this extraordinary thing, because the Jews are criticized when they integrate and when they don't. And so what we see at the moment, I think, is just a new version of a very, very old hatred. And people sometimes say, well, that's too easy. Surely you can be anti-Israeli without being anti-Semitic. And I think not really. Or if you spend all of your attentions focusing on the one Jewish state in the world and not on any of the neighboring states, I won't let you get away with that. And yes, it's pretty extraordinary. I wrote an op-ed this week in the Post saying that I'm very struck. I've been in Israel for most of the last few months, since October, for various reasons, one of which was that I knew immediately it happened that we would have Holocaust denial in real time. I knew that people would start saying it hadn't happened and all that sort of thing. And my experience is the best way to counter that is to see things with your own eyes.
Anti-Semitism is history's most flexible conspiracy theory. Jews are somehow both evil capitalists and communist revolutionaries, too religious and too secular, too isolated and too integrated. Look at Israel today. The only democracy in the Middle East gets more UN condemnations than all dictatorships combined. And now we're seeing October 7th, denial in real time. Exactly like Holocaust denial. When people spend all their energy condemning the world's only Jewish state while ignoring neighboring dictatorships, well, that's not about politics anymore.
And the year before, I was in Ukraine with the Ukrainian army when they're making advances. And I wrote this piece this week saying it's rather striking, actually. My friend Neil Ferguson gave me this idea in a piece. It's rather striking that there's an utter difference between the way these two conflicts that I've seen with my own eyes are reported, written about, and discussed. I don't think we've seen Russian students attacked on campuses, so far as I know. I'd deprecate it if they were. I don't think we've seen Russian embassies assaulted or protested. Nobody says that Ukraine must only win a little bit or is calling for a ceasefire. I mean, your Prime Minister, sorry, I don't want to zone in again, but your Prime Minister is one of several Western leaders who seems to get a certain sense of machismo by standing beside Zelensky, and good for him. But none of them call for ceasefire in Ukraine. They call for victory. And they want victory all the way. They say, we will arm them as much as possible until they win. And one of the perverse things I've noted, I've covered most wars in Israel since 2006. One of the perverse things about every war involving Israel is that Israel's never allowed to win. And every single time they're accused of genocide, 2009, with a relatively minor operation in the Gaza, they were accused of genocide. And I wrote a piece the other day saying, if you add up all of the dead of all of the wars involving Israel from all sides, from and including the War of Independence in 1948, when Israel's neighbors all tried to eradicate it and strangle it at birth, you get up to a death toll of something like 65,000 people. And that's using the highest death tolls on the Arab side.
And that's dead on both sides?
On both sides, in every war involving Israel from 1948 to now. That is 6 months of average killing in Syria for the last 13 years.
Here's a mind-bending double standard. Western leaders proudly arm Ukraine for total victory, as they should, but demand Israel use proportional force. Not so fun fact, all Israeli conflicts combined since 1948 killed 65,000 total, which Syria casually achieves in every 6 months. No one attacks Russian students or demands Moscow show restraint. But watch how fast genocide trends when Israel defends itself. Same Western leaders who pose with Zelensky suddenly develop ceasefire fever when it's Jews fighting back. Curious, isn't it? Meanwhile, the UN's passed more resolutions against Israel than all other countries combined. Talk about selective outrage. But hey, I'm sure that's just a coincidence, right? So any thoughts on what Douglas and Brian Lee Crowley just discussed? Share them in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you never miss any of Douglas's debates.